So I want to welcome you all to this webinar session organized by Projecteer, UKRN, and FORTTand. My name is Ebuka Ezeike, and I'm joining in from Nigeria. So I'll be the moderator for this session. So today, like Richard said, I am representing FORTTand, which is the framework for open and reproducible research training. So you can reach out to our website on FORTTand.org. And that is FORTTand.org. So maybe I'll share that in the chat subsequently. So in case you're just hearing about FORTTand for the first time, I would like to give a little intro about what FORTTand is all about. So FORTTand is a community built to advance research transparency, reproducibility, rigor, and ethics through pedagogical reform and meta-scientific research. So in a nutshell, FORTTand provides the needed infrastructure and resources designed to recognize and support the teaching and mentoring of open and reproducible science, its integration into higher education and meta-science, for example, on topics like replication, reproducibility, and representation in academia. So in today's session, we will be discussing the topic, turning vague student curiosity into well-defined research questions. And that will be based on the pre-recorded video by our guest speaker. So I'm going to give you a run-through of how our session is going to go today. So I'm going to start by introducing our guest speaker. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to pass the mic to him for more introductory remarks and then a recap of the pre-recorded video. So after that, I'll proceed to ask him some questions which I've prepared. And as soon as we're done with that, I'll then go on to invite the members of the audience to make comments or ask whichever question they might have. And they can do this by typing their questions in the chat or raising their virtual hand, and I'll go on to call them to ask their question out loud. All right, so I'll go straight into the introduction right now. So our guest today is Nicholas Huntington-Klein, who is an assistant professor of economics at the Seattle University in the United States of America. So thank you so much for joining us today, Nick.
Of course.
It's indeed an honor to have you with us here today. I'll now pass the mic over to you for more introductory remarks and a recap of the pre-recorded video. Thank you.
Yeah, so as a recap of what I'm talking about today, so we're looking at the teaching of research, right? When you have students who are engaging in their own research projects, especially, when they want to figure something out, right? And this is a common thing that we do in classrooms, in college, where students have been learning about research, but they have to actually then go and do some for their own. And how do they do it well? And one of the things that I think is hardest for students to figure out, and that we don't really have a standard or common way of teaching, is getting to a solid research question, right? Students have these ideas about things they want to study, but in order to actually do research, you can't just say, well, I'm interested in shoes, and so I'm going to write about shoes, right? You have to have an actual question that you're trying to answer in order to do research on it properly. And so the question is, how can you go from having a vague thing that you're curious about, which students often do, to having a workable and useful research question? How can you tell when a research question is actually good? So there's sort of a checklist process almost of going through to recognize when a good research, to come up with a good question. And then once you have a candidate good question, to figure out whether it actually is good. And a lot of this comes down to thinking carefully through what will come of the research question, right? Will this encourage you to look at data sources that you actually have access to, right? Especially in the context of a student project where the scale needs to be relatively small. Will you once you get data, will that data actually allow you to answer the question that you are interested in, right? It's very easy to come up with a question that will not actually be answered, right? Or will not actually answer the theory that you want, right? The classic example of this is, correlation versus causation, right? If you're interested in whether one thing causes another, but you just collect data that allows you to get a correlation between the two of them, that research question that you're answering, or that research question that you come up with, are these two things correlated, will not actually answer the research, the thing that you're interested in, which is do one of these things cause the other. But there's also many other ways in which those two things can be misaligned. Even if you have, causality, maybe it doesn't answer your question of interest. Maybe the question that you have will encourage you to use data that doesn't work for the thing that you're trying to do. It's poorly measured, or it doesn't ill-defined, or just answers a different question that you weren't interested in. So that's the recap of the project, right? It's sort of a checklist of walking students through. Here's some ways in which you can sort of come up with some good research question ideas. And then once you have those ideas, how can you evaluate them and see whether they are actually decent research questions that you can answer on the scale and budget of a usually undergraduate researcher in college in a single term class.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick, for that wonderful recap. So I'll go right into the questions. All right. So my first question will be, so is it a standard process for students to follow the checklist you mentioned in the video to be able to evaluate the quality of their research question?
I don't think that it is a standard process. I think that there's in a lot of research classes that I've seen, a lot of the emphasis is on the methods or the analytic process, and coming up with the research question itself is sometimes not even part of the project. Right? There's a lot of classes in which the research question is provided for students, which cuts out the problem, but also I think cuts out an important part of actually doing research. In cases where it is a selection that students can make in terms of what the research question is, certainly people, I'm not the first person to think of this, right? But I find often that students are a bit left out in the weeds in terms of figuring out whether the research question is a good one. Sometimes it can be, just sort of assuming that students will figure it out, right? Or recognize when a good research question is not had, or it will just come to a pass through the professor where the student come up with a question and then the professor will be the one to determine whether it actually makes sense or not. I think that a checklist approach is not something that I've seen very often, if at all.
Okay. So that's very nice. So, and that will lead me to the next question, which is how does the checklist? So how would you relate this checklist now to how does it relate or differ to pre-registering a research project or writing a pre-analysis plan for a project?
Yeah, so there's a similarity here between the checklist process that I'm suggesting and what we already do as professional researchers in terms of pre-registering our results, right? So a lot of the checklist approach emphasizes basically making sure that the analysis that you're going to do, the research question that you have is going to actually answer the question of interest, right? And pre-registration is on a similar line, right? Where you are coming up ahead of time with the entire plan of your research, which encourages you to think through, okay, well, what will I actually end up with at the end, right? We don't want to get to the end of a large research project only to realize that the variables that we collected don't actually allow us to answer the question that we're interested in. And this is a similar process for trying to head off that same issue for students, where by having them think through, if not necessarily formally lay out, but having them just think through the whole process of what they're going to end up with, encourages them to select a project for which it can actually be done, and the results that they get at the end will actually be meaningful. Right. So it is by forcing a certain amount of pre-thought, encouraging similar practices to what a researcher would do when they are pre-registering their analysis, and similarly giving pre-thought to the entirety of their project before they actually embark on it.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much. So let me go back to the checklist now. So from the checklist you mentioned, which of them would you say um, is usually like a struggle for most of the students you coached, or like which of them would you say they easily forget?
Hmm. So I think the biggest struggle is looking ahead to the data and sort of imagining what the data will be like at the end, because that's something they haven't really done before. And it's a hypothetical, right? Where you are asking students who have worked with data, maybe 4 or 5 times realistically, to imagine a whole new data set that doesn't exist yet,
Mm,
and then imagine what they can and can't do with it. Right. So that is a high bar. You can help that a little bit by producing some fake data or just having them write down sort of what the columns in their data might be. Uh, and I think making it a bit more concrete can help a little bit in terms of getting students to sort of recognize what this actually looks like. So I think that's the hardest one uh, that students come to. Um, there's also uh, without the checklist, there's a lot of
mm,
wishful thinking that students will get into, right? Where I'm interested in this thing. Here's some data that's sort of related. So therefore, that data will answer my thing, right?
mm,
And there's a gap in the middle there in terms of how that connection is actually made.
yeah,
And so that's also very difficult for students, right? To recognize
mm,
that you can have related data on a thing, and it might not actually answer your question, right?
yeah,
Um, as a good example of this, right, I have in my data visualization class, there's a project where students get to pick their own data, and this isn't like a deep research question. It's a business class. It's really just make a presentation about this data, and students when I first ran this, right, this is and now I've implemented a lot of elements of the checklist in that project. But when I
mm,
started, I had a lot of students who had this idea. Okay, I've got this idea. I'm going to look at the market for movie theaters, and look how revenues have changed over time. Oh, I found this data on Kaggle, and then they get 4 weeks into the project before they actually open up the data and realize, oh, there's 5 observations in here. And half of the variables that it said it had on the documentation are missing for half the observations, and I can't do anything with this, right? Um, and so thinking through, whether the data that you have can actually answer your question is a good, preventative measure for those students who
yeah.
aren't even going to have time to start over, right? In the context of a course.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to go right to the next question. Now let's look at it this way. Now, a student might ask something broad like, why do some schools do better than others? So how would you help them make that into a focused, doable research question?
Yeah. Yeah, so students often will go way too broad with their
Mhm.
with the research questions, right? We've all, if you've ever taught kind of quantitative data class, right, you've always gotten the question like, oh yeah, what are the determinants of this thing, right? Where this thing is, GDP or earnings or whatever it is, where there's 1,000 determinants, right? And there's no way you can do a good job isolating any of them or isolating
Mhm.
them all or doing them all at once. Sorry. And so I think that uh, the a good way to narrow things down is to have students walk through the process of what it would look like to try to have all of those things at once, right?
Okay.
To say, okay, you want to know the determinants of GDP. Well, let's imagine that here's your regression. I'm going to make up a regression that you might have run, right? GDP is, it's equal to, log GDP is zero point 0.2 plus zero point 0.3 times the year plus zero point 0.4 times this plus zero point 0.1 times this. And
Yeah.
well, do you really think that you've got it, that this is separating out all the determinants? Right? What's the data that you had to get to this? Do you really believe the results of this regression? And having something to look at that's concrete, I think makes it easier for students to recognize that the broad question doesn't work, right? Because the first step in going from the broad question to a narrow one is actually convincing the student that no, you actually can't do that, right? It's not just that I'm saying you can't as your professor, it's that your results won't mean anything realistically. Um, and so a good example of that, I teach a behavioral economics class where I have students do their own experiment, sort of psychology lab style, right? And
Yeah.
again, when I first started doing it out, a lot of students would end up with, experimental results they really couldn't trust, right? And they would have weird things in their data and then recognize at the end, oh, I actually, this doesn't really tell me anything.
Yeah.
Because I accidentally, I varied three different things in my experimental measure, right? That was a very common
Yeah.
issue that I ran into where students would, they would vary, though they would vary the wording on the survey and the topic of the question and also, the demographic they were asking to all at the same time. And so it'd be, one condition with none of those things and one condition with all those things. And so showing them that they can't do that, the results would not make any sense. That's the first step.
Mhm.
And then narrowing it down, actually coming up with a narrower question uh,
Okay.
is the second step. It varies a lot based on the actual topic. It could come down to just giving some examples of what the good levels of the question would be, right?
Mm.
Here, you're varying one thing in your experimental design, as an example. Now pick what you want it to be. So giving them a target, showing that the initial thing doesn't work, and then giving them a target of what a example looks like, I think are the two first steps.
All right. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful response. All right. So before we head into the audience giving their own questions, let me just ask this final one. So students often have like limited time, data, or money. So how can they adjust their research question to fit these limits while still keeping it meaningful?
Yeah. So there's two parts to that. So one is access to data, right? So if you're doing observational or any sort of quantitative stuff, you have access to data issues, right? Either, the ability to get people into your lab to do an experiment or whatever, or finding data online.
Yeah.
And for this, I think for students, they have to start with what they have access to, which
Mhm.
as a professional researcher is not what you want to do, right? You want to start with what's the interesting research question first. But saying to students, okay, well, go look for some data, see what it looks like. Or, we've talked in the class about how to go access this census data. Or, you're going to do a lab and you can maybe get 20 of your friends to come in, and that would be pretty impressive if you did, right? So starting with what the limitation is or what the expectations are for the
Mhm.
project to frame things, I think helps. Um, and then getting them to get the appropriate level. Observational data, I think it comes down to holding their hand and showing them where the data is to give them as much access as possible, right? Because they don't know what data sources are available. And so having in the context of whatever the class is, here's the full range of places where you can go look to see what's available. So to give them as much of a scale as you can, I think is helpful there. And encouraging them to look at the data early. So I think a big part of it, right? So that they have a chance to have a fallback. Uh, I mentioned that data visualization project. I have since started that project a week earlier than I used to, so that students have a chance to find a data set, look at it, make sure that the data is there, and if it's not, start over again. Um, so that I think has helped. In terms of lab experiments, I don't think that my personal opinion about lab experience, especially at an undergrad level, is that they're not going to be able to have an appropriate size no matter what, right? You're probably not going to run a several hundred person, lab experiment that's going to get you sufficient statistical power as an undergrad. Maybe you have a really great lab. I don't know. But for that, I would say making sure that the process is good and saying, well, from the start, we're probably not going to end up with a reasonable result because your sample size is going to be too small, but let's do everything else right. I think is one way you can approach that you can take to this, or gathering students together so it's a big group project and maybe you can get a reasonable number.
Cool. Thank you very much for that wonderful response. So I see we have a question in the chat, and it's from Ashad Azad. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So his comment and question is this. He says, "Hi Nick, great video talking about feasibility. With observational data, most of times we cannot answer casual question." It then goes on to say, "How can we go about this? How to best answer the research question then?"
Mhm.
Do I take it again, or did you get the question?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so I think that, it's true that there's a lot of contexts in which, you just don't have access to a good, a causal inference research design just is not really feasible, right? Or not accessible, right? You don't have, the quasi-experimental things that you need to be in place. You could run a thing with some controls and call it a day, but again, that's, probably not going to be the most believable thing. In the context of teaching, I think it comes down to what you want the students to come away with, where you can say, okay, I recognize you're going to have some biases left in your analysis, but I want you to think carefully through what the causal inference research design should be, or what the causal diagram is, what are the controls that you should be having in here, and then say, well, you don't have all of them. So are you going to be willing to go ahead with this project, recognizing that your results aren't going to make sense, but you've done the process properly? Um, or are you going to need to look for something else, right? And so in that context, it can come down to looking first for where you can feasibly apply the tools that you've learned in class if you're trying to really focus on, quasi-experimental design, things like that. And in that case, encouraging a feasible thing might require that you just give people things that they can sort of reproduce, right? As opposed to going and searching out their own thing, right? Unless it's a larger, like, sort of capstone project in which you can say, yeah, go find a policy that you can apply these tools to. Another approach that you can take is teaching partial identification, where you say, okay, I recognize that you're unlikely to find, a clean instrumental variable or regression discontinuity or something like that, but we're going to take really seriously what is missing from the analysis on the scale that you have it, and we're going to try to size the bias to say, this is, we're leaving something out. Okay, don't just say we're leaving something out. Try to, put some bounds on this. And so you can, it's not infeasible to teach something like partial identification in a undergraduate methods class. And that would, and what that one thing that does is it allows students to have a range to a feasible analysis, that a research question that can actually answer in a much wider range of contexts, because you can always do partial identification. And so that allows students to have feasibly sized projects in a lot more situations.
Okay, so thank you very much. I see Abdul Rahman made a comment to that same question, and he said, we can use observational data to answer questions through several methods, including casual DAGs. And then he went on to say that Nick has a useful book that might introduce this and other concepts. The book's name is The Effects: An Introduction to Research, Design, and Causality, and the new edition has just been published. So can you just quickly say something around that book, Nick, while we take some other questions? I see we have some other questions here.
Yeah, so the book is about causal inference and research design. So the first half of the book is, very non-technical. It's just about how can you make sure that you have identified the answer to a research question, right? What are the methods what are the things that you need to do to identify a causal effect? And then the second half is all tools, regression and differences, things like that. And so the book is designed to help people set up a causal inference research design. And so if a causal question is something that students have in mind with observational data, there's a lot of tools in there for figuring out how you can identify the answer to those questions in data, and then what are the tools that you can use, and sometimes what are the quasi experiments that you can set up to help answer that, right? Things that you might often learn about in an econometrics class. That said, it is also true to the original question that those methods require certain things to be true about the data and the world, right? If you want to run a difference in differences or regression discontinuity or instrumental variable or something like that, you can't just go ahead and just do that, right? You need the proper setting to have the proper thing to have occurred in the real world that you can take advantage of. And so it is true that those methods that you can learn about in the book can't always be applied to every question that you're interested in. But I did in the second chapter, in the second edition, add a new chapter on partial identification, which is what I just mentioned, which would allow you to answer questions in a lot broader range of situations.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So I'll go on to the next question, which is, it says, you work in economics, and then it says, what other research disciplines could also use this approach?
Yeah, so I think any quantitative field could use this approach. So I mean, obviously, anybody who's doing work with observational data, that's very similar to what economists do. Even if it's not causal in nature, all of these questions still apply, right? Nothing about this requires it to be causal inference or anything like that. Similarly, in any of the lab-based fields, there's a similar question of, you really don't want to get to the end of an experiment and realize that, oh, the data that I've collected doesn't actually answer my question. And the checklist process really works the same in that. I tried to design the checklist in a way that it applies equally to the lab-based fields as it does to a more sort of observational data type of setting. So that's the idea. It might be a bit more of a stretch to do it in, research in fields that are not quantitative in nature, right? If your research is, a lit review, right? These are, you also have to ask whether, how you're going to answer the question that's in your lit review, but it would be a different process.
All right, thank you very much. We also have another question here in the chat. It says, any good source for partial identification for undergrad level?
Yeah. So there's not a lot currently at the undergrad level for partial identification, except for the chapter in my new book, in the second edition of my book. It's the new chapter that I've added. And the book is free if you want to direct your students to it. It's at theeffectbook.net. And there's a chapter there that walks through sort of the logic behind partial identification, which, by the way, in some other fields goes by other names. It's one of those things where the method is called different things in different fields. But wherever you are trying to say, I want to identify a causal effect, but I don't think I can't actually make the assumptions that I need to make, which might include things like assuming that I've controlled for all the things I need to control for. What can I do? Can I still give go from, I maybe can't give a specific answer, but I can say, well, the answer is between here and here. That's partial identification. And so it goes through that logic, and then also some of the methods that you can use in regression or matching to say, well, I can't control for everything I need to control for. I can't match for everything I need to match on that the causal diagram says I need to, but I can get close in the methods that you can apply to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for those wonderful responses, Nick. So I'll go right into the next question because I see there is no other question in the chat. But then as a member of the audience, if you feel you have some other questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to do so. If you have any comments you would like to make, feel free to do so. If you don't want to type it in the chat, you can just put up your virtual hand and I'll call you to ask out loud. All right, so I think, okay, somebody just posted something. Okay, that's just a picture. All right, so I'll go right into the next question. So my question is this. Should students be allowed to try out like a weak question and then fix it later? What can they learn from starting a question that doesn't work well? Maybe you would have mentioned that before the course of your explanation, but can you just retreat on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the best thing pedagogically would be to allow students to start with a weak question and fix it later. The problem is that in the context of a term project, they're probably going to run out of time if they do that, right? They're probably, because it takes a long time just to get enough into a research question to realize that it doesn't work and then start over. So I think in a perfect world, you would do that. I think it'd be a great instructive moment to be able to do that. But practically, I think that you're sort of setting that student up for failure in the class. And so I think that's one reason why I think the checklist makes sense is to head that off at the pass, right? To sort of start out from having a stronger question to start with means that you're more likely to be able to actually get a project that you can finish and be confident in by the end. That said, I think it is a very good learning opportunity to try out a bad question and see why it doesn't work. Would be a lot more satisfying and probably stick in your head a lot better as to what makes a good research question than just following a checklist. If you have a lot of time, then I think that would probably be even better than the checklist. But you're asking students to pour a lot of time into something that's not going to work.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I see we have another question in the chat from Richard. It says, to what extent can reading previous research on a topic help students formulate a well-defined research question? Do you have any suggestions about tips to give students about reviewing previous studies in a productive way that helps them formulate a research question?
Mm-hmm. So reading previous studies, I mean, helps, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is not as helpful as we would expect it to be, usually, for a couple reasons. One is that, when you read previous research, it sort of feels, especially to students, like it just sort of came out of the sky, like fully formed, right? You have these professors who've been doing this a long time, and they sort of, they really know what they're doing. And here's a research project, and they just it's like magic, right? There's not you don't see into the process so much. And so I think that it can be a little intimidating to try to take that and figure out a research question from it. And additionally, often papers aren't transparent about why their research question works, at least in a way that is legible to people who aren't already doing their own research for a long time. Um, you know, the justification for why you're doing what you're doing is often targeted at people who could probably figure it out on their own, right? So I think reading previous research it certainly can be helpful, but the way that you can direct students to get the most out of it, I think, is picking papers for them that explain themselves very well, which isn't every paper, right? And having them focus on the conclusion, I think, is the most instructive part of the paper usually, because what the conclusion will do is it will take that step of going from the results to linking it back to the explanation of why you care about it. And that's the step that I think is easiest to miss, right? And it helps sort of get rid of a little bit of that sort of it fell from the sky effect, where you can see, okay, well, they ran all these analyses, they ran these regressions. Again, how did they come up with these regressions? Magic, probably. And then in the end, oh, here's why I ran that, because it lets me answer this particular question. So I think having students focus on the conclusion and picking papers for them for the class that have a well-explained conclusion, because again, not everyone does, I think is the way to go the farthest in that. If they're doing their own research literature review that you can't pick for them, then just going through the examples in class of what to look for in a conclusion, I think when you are working on papers together or reading papers together, I think is good. So directing their attention, I think, is the best way to get the most out of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. I hope that answers your question, Richard. If not, you can type in a follow-up question, or would you want to say anything around that?
Could I just follow up? I think it's an interesting thing. This is sort of a different question, but it's actually related. So I really appreciate all your comments, because I have a class where students write research papers, and this is they all think that learning to use the software is going to be really hard, and that's like really easy. And they think that coming up with a question is going to be really easy, and that's really hard. And so these are things to think about a lot and don't have any really neat answers for. So let me throw out one kind of question that students ask, or like a topic they'll propose. They'll say, what are the factors that affect whether women join the labor force? And that's often a kind of thing, like, what are the factors that affect X? Or maybe like, how is X related to Y? And contrast that kind of question to something like, does the number of kids they have affect whether women join the labor force? And like, did the number of kids a woman has and her marital status affect whether they join the labor force? And so the difference is like, instead of saying like, how is X related to Y, it's like, to what effect did these specific named factors affect the relationship between X and Y? So as opposed to just sort of vaguely, vaguely sort of looking for what might matter versus having some hypotheses that matter to begin with. Now, probably the way I framed it sort of tips my cards about what I sort of guide students to, but do you have any thoughts about the usefulness as a starting place for those different kinds of questions?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, the question is, right, how do you get students from these very broad and generic questions, right, to something that's a bit more actionable or useful? And I think that that is a common enough approach, especially in observational settings. Because I mean, I see that, you see that, everybody sees that, right? Where students are coming up with these very broad, what are all the determinants of this thing, right? That it is worth addressing specifically, right? Going into the, okay, here's our term project, here's some things you can do, here's some things you shouldn't do, here's our checklist for coming up with a good research question. By the way, as we're coming up with this research question, here's a thing that a lot of students do that doesn't work. And here's why it doesn't work, which is, what are all the determinants of this thing? Here's, that's an example that I will give you when I'm telling you that, your question should be very specific, and here you should not make it. What are the 18 different determinants of, whether women join the labor force? So I think calling that one out by name, I think is helpful. Because I mean, all the examples that we give students that, here, we're going to read these research papers, none of them do that, right? And so it's not like they are mimicking something that, they are seeing. It's that is a natural place to start, right? That's the general curiosity. And so having that be a specific thing that you are, mentioning that, of course, you're going to start here, but let's not do that. I think is helpful to students because you're addressing the question, the obvious idea they're going to have and directing them away from it, as opposed to hoping that they're going to figure it out from first principles.
Okay.
The worry is that they read papers that look like they didn't start out as vague, let's see what's correlated with this. And then they find a few things and write a paper as if that was a pre-specified hypothesis. But
I see.
But that but so maybe it's better students don't know people were doing that, and maybe it may be better to think that they. But I mean, that's the whole thing about all the advanced development of a topic that you've talked about. I think is all aimed at preventing that, like getting them. So just one more question to follow up, and then I'm going to be quiet. But the last thing is, do you get students to write something up about the formulation of their topic before they dive into the data and everything?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I will always force students to outline their project and all the plans that they're going to go through before I sort of let them loose. Because otherwise they get too late in the project and something doesn't work every single time. And I mean, yeah, part of it is to make them make a plan so that they're not surprised. And part of it is that I can review it and say, oh, hey, this thing that you're planning to do is not going to work. Right. Because that's one of the most valuable things you can do as a guide for these research projects is to head off really obvious, big time wastes.
It does look like Ebuka has dropped out of the call. I assume a connection issue.
Yep.
So, I mean, I would like to extend a big thanks to Ebuka in case he doesn't make it back before we wrap up. But are there any further questions from the audience or from Richard or from you, Deanne? Ebuka is entered the waiting room, so I'll readmit him. And thank you, everyone, for your patience. In the chat, you're getting thank yous, Nick, for the helpful video. Thanks, Josie. Welcome back, Ebuka.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just had a little glitch.
Yeah, that's all right.
All right.
All right. So I guess Richard, you're done with your question and you've gotten enough clarity as to what you asked. All right. So as we look to get to the top of the hour, I would like to ask Nick if you have like a closing summary you would like to give before we round up the event.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, beyond the specific things that I'm talking about in, this checklist, thinking about the research question, I think that for students, I think the thing that's often missing from research projects is the the process of it, right? I think for a lot of students, it's a project that I have to do. I've learned, these tools in class, and so I'm going to try to take these tools. I'm going to slap them on top of whatever thing it is, and there's a lack of forethought to it or planning, right? And to some extent, that's sort of necessary because for a lot of them, it's the first time they're doing it, and it's really hard to have forethought about something that you've never done before. And I think threading the needle between those two things is the task. That's right. That's the difficult task. And it doesn't just have to be about the quality of the data in the research question. It also has to be about helping students think through, okay, let's help you plan out your time so that you don't get to, the last 3 days of this project and you haven't started yet. Right. And that's something that we will normally do, right, with students is help them plan out their time. And so taking that to other levels of planning, recognizing that, students haven't done this before and helping them produce the forethought that they could not possibly produce on their own because they've never done this before, I think is likely to help focus students' time on the more pedagogically valuable parts of the project, right? Because getting to the last 2 days of your project and doing it all and really fast and not knowing that it's not very, very good and getting a bad grade is instructive and a life lesson in one way, but it doesn't teach you that much about research in another, right? And so if you want them to learn about the research, you want to make sure that you're avoiding that particular forethought problem, and that's what we do, right? And thinking about that same thing in other ways, like, oh, hey, I'm going to let you loose and do this literature review, but also there's papers out there that are not worth reading, and let's help you figure out how to identify those so you can skip them. Will, I think, help students direct their time towards the things that are going to help them learn the most. So developing that forethought for students in lots of different ways is, I think, a thing that's going to really help them out.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful summary. So as we head to the top of the hour, let me just wrap up at this point. So I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us in this wonderful webinar session. Thank you all to the members of the NDS as well. So we've been discussing with Nick Huntington-Klein, an assistant professor of economics at Seattle University in the United States of America. And then we'll be discussing around the topic of turning vague student curiosity into well-defined research questions. So the next event or webinar session in this symposium will take place next week. That's the 9th of October, 2025. And then it's going to be at exactly 2 p.m., the same time as today's webinar session. That's BST, British Standard Time. So, and the speaker for our next event is going to be Ann Nurse, who is a professor of sociology at the College of Worcester, Ohio, in the US as well. And then the discussion will be about her video titled First Steps from Point and Click to Reproducibility. The registration link will be sent out before the event. And then also the link to Anne's video will also be sent to everyone who registers. So I want to say a big thank you again to each and every one of you for joining us today. And then a big thank you as well to the organizers, Projectile, UKRN, and FORTTand for also giving me this opportunity to act as your moderator in today's webinar. And then a big thank you to our special guest as well, Nick Huntington-Klein. Thank you for sharing your great insights with us today. And then I look forward to seeing each and every one of you in our next webinar session next week. So I don't know if any of the member of the organizers have any other thing to say, but in the absence of any other thing, I think it's a goodbye from here, and do have a lovely day or night, depending on where you're joining us from.
Thank you, Ebuka. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Very nicely done. Thank you, everybody. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And it's really wonderful to hear about how we can work together and how we can kind of work collaboratively to help people find the right questions to ask rather than letting students kind of struggle through it. Like, this is about the strength of gathering together and finding the right questions to ask so that the research itself is the best it can be. So thank you so much, Nick and Richard and Ebuka for coming together and working with us at UKRN. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.